So I think Leo is recording now. Yeah, so we're lucky today to have Dr. Candice Schumann here to give a talk in the Fairness in AI seminar series at the University of Maryland. Candice is a distinguished alumnus of the UMD CS department. She got her PhD here about a year ago, I guess, and has been up in Pittsburgh as a researcher at Google Research for the last, I don't know, year or so. And she's done a lot of nice work in fairness, as well as in diversity promotion in automated systems, machine learning, and AI writ large. And so today she'll be talking about some recent work coming out of Google that will appear in some form at AIES in a month or two. And without further ado, I guess Candice, take it away.
Cool. All right. Yeah. Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about a new data set that we are releasing at AIES this year. And the work is called A Step Toward More Inclusive People Annotations for Fairness. Cool. Oops. There we go. Okay. So yeah, today, basically my talk is going to be broken down into 5 different sections. So we're going to start off with computer vision. What is it? Then we're going to take a deep dive into a well-known computer vision data set. And then we're going to talk about the new data set that we created. All right. So let's talk about computer vision and attributes and how it all relates to fairness as well. So here are some computer vision tasks. Obviously, not all computer vision tasks are here because there are plenty, but let's just go over a few of them so you can get an idea of like what we're kind of dealing with when I talk about computer vision and fairness. So the first one is classification. So what objects are in an image? So for example, in each of these images, there are cats. There's also identification, or what specific type of object is in the image. So for example, the first image is a black cat, or more specifically, a black cat named Mitty. There's also verification. Are there cats in these images? There's detection. So for example, there's a cat with a bounding box drawn around it that says, here is the cat. There's landmark detection. So what are the key points for the cats in the images? So for example, you could say like, where are the cat's eyes, their ears, their nose? There's segmentation. So what pixels in the image belong to the object in the image? So for example, that yellow cat, all of the yellow pixels belong to the cat. And then there's also captioning. So it's like describe the image in open text. So for example, that first image, I would describe it something like a black cat lying on its back on a blanket. So yeah, so these are a lot of computer vision tasks. And in order to do these tasks, you need data sets. So there's some common data sets that most people know about. So there's ImageNet, which is a data set that's organized by the WordNet hierarchy. There's MS COCO, which has object detection, segmentation, and captioning. And then there's Open Images, which we're going to talk a lot about today. So this data set has image level labels, object bounding boxes, segmentation, visual relationships, and localized narratives. Specifically today, though, we're going to be talking about object detection. So drawing boxes around various objects or things. And then there's fairness, right? So in fairness research, you generally need sensitive attributes in order to evaluate some sort of disparities in models. Also, a large number of fairness mitigation techniques require access to sensitive attributes at training time. So for example, you could have like traditional adversarial learning techniques where you try and differentiate between gender or race at training time to make the model more fair. And then, you know, in the fairness community, there's a lot of common data sets that are used, like UCI Adult, where you try and predict income level, and they have sensitive attributes of race and gender. And then there's the Compass recidivism risk data set where you try and predict recidivism risk, and there are sensitive attributes of race and gender as well. But all of these are just like feature vectors. There's not like images that you need for computer vision. So in the original Open Images dataset, there are people categories, specifically man, woman, boy, girl, where you can potentially take out gender, so man versus woman, and age, like man versus boy. So it could be potentially useful for fairness analysis, maybe. Let's look at it. Let's see what it looks like. So let's take a deep dive into Open Images and how it was created and what the properties are. So Open Images, as I said, is a computer vision data set. There are about 9 million images associated with it. And for each of the images, you have image level labels and object bounding boxes. So for example, the example images have a lot of bounding boxes around alpacas. And like many other image data sets like ImageNet and MS COCO, Open Images is a partial ground truth data set, which means that not every single object or thing in the image is boxed. So you can see, for example, in the top right, there's an image with a box around an alpaca, but no box around a person. That being said, so 6.2% of all of the images in Open Images have at least known people inside of them. So that picture up there is not one of the 6.2% of images that I'm talking about because it doesn't have any boxes drawn around people. But yes, 6.2% is still a large percentage of 9 million images. And then out of all of the bounding boxes in Open Images, people make up 12.6%. So it's quite a large data set in terms of like people existing in them and potentially being able to use it for human-centric detection. Whoops. Nope. Okay, there we go. All right. So how do we get from like images to having bounding boxes? So first what happens is you give a classifier images, and that classifier generates image level labels. So for example, you could give it an image and it could pop out image level labels of cat, person, and car. Then what happens is that we want to verify the image level labels. So those, the images and the labels are sent to annotators, and annotators are asked, is there a cat in this picture? And they can either say yes or no. And so we get human verified image level labels of both negative and positive. So for example, you could have an image where you have positive image level labels of cat and person and a negative image level label of car. Yes, okay, so then what happens is, so those image level labels and the verified image level labels are quite large. Like the number of possible classes is large. So what then happens is those are reduced to 600 classes that are considered the boxable classes. And those classes are then again sent to annotators, and the annotators are asked to draw boxes around each of the classes. But specifically, human labelers are asked to draw a box around the most specific label given the Open Images hierarchy. So what does that mean? So for example, you could have, there's one part of the hierarchy that has the upper part being car and then a lower leaf node being limousine. So for example, this image has positive image level labels of palm tree, car, limousine, wheel, and some other things. But because limousine is more specific than car, none of the cars are boxed. Instead, only the limousine is boxed. And this kind of makes sense in that, when annotating 9 million images, like you can't just go and box every single thing. It would just be an absolutely absurd task. So yeah, so instead we do the partial annotations using the hierarchy. And this sort of way of annotating images is pretty standard practice. So yeah, like ImageNet and MS Coco do something fairly similar. But, okay, so cars, limousines, that's all right. But what happens when we have people? Because people aren't just regular objects, right? People are people, they're special. So in Open Images, we have the person hierarchy, where you have person being the top node and man, woman, boy, girl being the leaf nodes. And this makes sense for images with just one person in them. So like all of these images over here, the example of man, woman, girl, and boy, they all seem to be appropriately boxed. But that doesn't happen all the time because we have this, we only box the most specific thing. So what happens, for example, is you get an image like this, where the positive image level labels are person, woman, and suit. And of course, because we're only labeling the most specific things, you have boxes drawn around women, but then there are a number of other people in the image that aren't boxed and instead are just labeled as suits, which is potentially problematic when you're trying to, evaluate a model and you're saying, okay, does this work for men versus women? And you can't really evaluate that because, there are other people in this image that you're not really seeing. And this happens in both directions. So for example, this image has positive image level labels of person, man, suit, and clothing. And so because man is more specific than person and suit is more specific than clothing, you only have boxes drawn around the man and the suit. And the other person in this image is just has no boxes drawn around them at all. And this gets more complicated when you think about the syntactic differences, right? So for example, age range. So during the classification step, looking at this image, the classifier said, oh, there's a man in this image and there's a girl in this image, which seems somewhat reasonable, but an annotator said, no, there's no girl in this image. This is clearly a woman, so it's not a girl. So we have a negative image level label for girl, but the annotator was not able to provide a replacement, so there's no woman replacement, and therefore only a man is boxed, which again is potentially problematic. But then it gets even more complicated. So the difference between girl and woman can be a little bit confusing and subjective. So for example, this image has a positive image level label of girl, and it's kind of hard to see, but only this person and this person have boxes drawn around them. And the rest of the people don't. Even though, like, at least to my eye, they seem to be relatively the same age. Everyone in this picture seems to be relatively the same age, and they're all, feminine presenting people, but only two of them have boxes around them. And this kind of, is because of a weird syntactic difference between like man versus girl and, man versus boy and girl versus woman. I mean, you can think about how you use boy and girl in a day-to-day sense. Girl is a little bit looser, right? You can call an adult by girl. They sometimes, but that's not true of boy. You can't say, to an adult male and like you can't call him like boy, right? It's not a done thing. And there's differences in definitions like everywhere you look, right? Even in Wikipedia, there's a very clear difference between how girl is defined and versus how boy is defined. The same is true in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. So I mean, like these differences are found, all over the place. And then on top of that, image content can influence the labels that are generated in the classifier step. And, that could potentially, like that just seeps all the way down through the pipeline and can potentially, exist, like correspond to existing societal stereotypes. So for example, we find in the original Open Images dataset that in a lot of wedding pictures, only feminine presenting people have boxes drawn around them. This is probably because, like in Western weddings, the main focus of the wedding is the bride. And then additionally, there's like quite a few examples of military images where masculine presenting people have boxes drawn around them, but no feminine presenting people have boxes drawn around them, due to the classifier just like not really thinking about it, just like looking at image content and saying, oh, okay, this is military, it obviously should have men or boys inside of it. So yeah, all of this put together makes it potentially problematic as a fairness data set, and we wanted to try and fix that. So what we did was we came up with a new data set called MeApp, which stands for More Inclusive Annotations for People. So what we did was we took 100K randomly sampled images from Open Images and relabeled them. So the split was 70K from the training set and 30K split between validation and test. And we randomly sampled images that had at least one positive person label. So either person, man, woman, boy, or girl. And the first thing that annotators were asked to do was to ignore the person subtree and to just draw boxes around every person in the image. And then once that was done, annotators were then asked to go back in and to assign each of the different boxes to different attributes. The first attribute was perceived gender presentation. So annotators were asked to select either predominantly feminine, predominantly masculine, or unknown. Let's look at the differences between like this and the previous idea of man, woman, boy, girl. So first off, we recognize that gender is not binary and that individuals' gender identity cannot be determined by pixels. Like you cannot look at an image and say, this person has this gender identity because that's an internal attribute and not an external one. That being said, people can present differently. So they can present more feminine or more masculine. We also decided to not use the historic labels of female and male because that feels more like gender identity and it's not quite the same as gender presentation. So we're sticking to predominantly feminine and predominantly masculine. And yes, even though that this is not gender identity and it's definitely, and gender isn't binary and these are binary labels, still when used in aggregate, these annotations are still fairly useful to determine, how models perform over people who present gender differently. So that would be the first one. And we split up gender and then we also added age range. So annotators were able to select an age range of either young, middle, or older, or unknown to describe the age range of the individuals in the images. And this was based again solely on the appearance of the image and not the actual age of the person. And on the weird boundary cases of like that picture of the feminine presenting people, all I'm assuming bridesmaids at a wedding, if there's some confusion about, is this person young or are they middle or, are they middle or older, annotators were asked to prefer the older of the two categories just to create some consistency. And again, if for either of these attributes, if there's not enough information, like if the individual in the image is occluded somehow, or they're further away, or, you just can't tell what age range they are, or you can't really, you can't really assign a gender presentation, annotators were always allowed to select unknown and independently of each of the attributes. So they could select an unknown age and still select a gender presentation or vice versa. Yeah, so that was how we labeled them. So let's look at, what these new labels look like. So what we found was that roughly 30% of the randomly sampled images had boxes missing from them. And when I say boxes missing, I mean that the new MeApp annotations added more boxes than there was existing in the original Open Images dataset. And overall, we added about 96,000 new boxes, which is pretty cool. I think that's a pretty significant amount of boxes. And this is what the perceived gender presentation looks like in compared to the original data set. So the overall distribution remained fairly similar. So, there isn't that much difference between, the percentage of predominantly feminine and predominantly masculine. But what did change more significantly was the number of unknown boxes. And this is true both for perceived gender presentation and for perceived age range. And if you think about it, this makes sense, right? So even if an image had positive image level labels in the original Open Images dataset of all 4 of the subcategories of man, woman, boy, girl, and there was an individual that didn't fit nicely into any of those 4 buckets, then they wouldn't have boxes drawn around them. Whereas in this situation, all people are first boxed before assigning attributes. So it doesn't matter if a person, fits into any of these categories, they will still be boxed. That's why we have quite a considerable jump of unknown labels for both perceived age range and for perceived gender presentation. Also, another note is that because the original Open Images dataset just had man, woman, boy, girl, it didn't have this concept of older in an age range. So older was added with MeApp. And again, going back to this, what if a person doesn't fall into any of the 4 categories? What ended up happening is that MeApp, a lot of the new boxes are fairly small in comparison to the original Open Images dataset. So you have a lot more boxes of people that are further away and whatnot. And then, in terms, this was just basic analysis in terms of counts, but we wanted to also look at it a little bit more deeply. So we used normalized pointwise mutual information, or NPMI, to look at the differences between images that had boxes missing and images that didn't have any boxes missing. So basically what you could do is you could take the NPMI, which basically gives you a co-occurrence, and you say, okay, the NPMI co-occurrence of a label X and the co-occurrence with images with missing boxes. And you could do the same thing with the same label X, but without missing boxes. And then you can take the difference between the two to find labels that are more likely to co-occur with images that are missing people boxes than images that are not missing people boxes. Okay, that's kind of confusing, but this is what it looks like. So basically what we found was that, again, for the unknown labels for both gender presentation and for age range, you have a very high NPMI difference between missing boxes versus not missing boxes. And this is probably, again, because of the, the unknown boxes or, people that don't fit nicely into any of the 4 categories. The next highest thing is predominantly feminine. And this also kind of makes sense based off of, our deep dive, where there's this very clear confusion between woman and girl. And that ends up being shown where there's just quite a lot of boxes that are predominantly feminine that just don't get boxed. And then predominantly masculine is the next one. And then we get into the age ranges, with young being higher, again, probably because of the syntactic difference between girl and boy, and also the confusion around, boundary cases of teenage years. When does a person become no longer young? Okay, and this is what it looks like, when you're looking at the images. So the magenta boxes were all boxes that were originally found in the original Open Images. And in each of these cases, there were very clearly at least one person missing from each of the images, which MeApp was obviously able to get. So the yellow boxes were all added by MeApp. And each of the boxes, whether it's magenta or yellow, each have those two attributes associated with them. So cool, we have this data set. And let's talk about it in a little bit more in depth. And obviously this data set isn't the perfect data set. There are some limitations associated with them. So let's discuss them and then discuss about why it's still useful. So the first thing is perceived gender presentation. So again, it's really important to note that gender presentation and age range presentation don't actually represent the true gender identity of the individuals in these images, or their age range at the time when the picture was taken. And there is this definite trade-off between providing researchers the capability to do fairness analysis and fairness or bias mitigation work based on societal concepts of gender, while still perpetuating binary definitions of gender. So we tried to at least take a step back from that and say well, this isn't true gender identity, this is gender presentation, but there's still that binary aspect to it that's potentially problematic. So we suggest that future work can move maybe away from this, away from binary representations, and more look at the objective attributes that confound computer vision models. So a person may present feminine when they have long hair or if they're wearing makeup, or a person can present masculine if they have facial hair. And labeling each of these things could maybe help get down to the root cause of why models are performing poorly in certain subgroups. But that, that is a lot more, it's a much bigger undertaking to label every single, confounding attribute than it is to label, a binary attribute. We also wanted to note that this data set should absolutely not be used to create gender or age classifiers. So please don't do that. As a further precaution for the external release data set, any box that has the label young, the gender presentation has automatically been set to unknown, just to be safe. Also, let's where did this data come from, right? So internet imagery is constantly evolving. And I mean, you can see this very clearly in this past year where there's, an absurdly large number of images now that have people with face masks than there was, previously, especially when this data set was originally created. So, creating fairness or creating image data sets, they don't always stay true to the current time and what the models that are trained on them are being used for. Also, a lot of the image data sets, just like Open Image Dataset, is based off of Flickr images, which might not accurately describe, what the world looks like right now. And it's also, has a geographical skew towards more Western pictures. So there's a lot of pictures from the United States and not a lot of pictures from elsewhere in the world. So there is still that skew in the data. And also this research only really looked at one very specific part of the pipeline, just about people. So it only focused on the person hierarchy and the attributes associated with that person hierarchy. But there's a lot of the pipeline that wasn't touched. For example, image selection, which images do we choose to even include in the data set was not touched. We used the original classifier that said, okay, there is a person in this, but we definitely missed images where the classifier didn't find people where there definitely were people. this also only dealt with one part of the hierarchy. There's plenty of other hierarchies, like, for example, this clothing and suit question or image, where only the suit was labeled. And is the other outfit a suit? I don't know. So, that's a question. And then there's also the determination of the 600 classes that are considered boxable. So that wasn't touched either. And then, there's other parts of the Open Images data set that we didn't look at either. So we only dealt really with the object detection side, not with the object segmentation or the relationship triplets, or even, the captioning or anything like that. So there's plenty of future work, even on this data set, but on many of the other image data sets that exist. All that being said, we still think that this data set is particularly useful. Exhaustively annotated image data sets are very, very hard to find, and particularly valuable because it enables new types of analysis, like fairness analysis, right? So on the previous data set, when you had missing boxes of people in an image, you couldn't really perform fairness analysis on a model because you wouldn't really get, an accurate account of what was happening. You also really couldn't get, a good idea of how accurate the model is, right? Because if you say, okay, find all the people, you create a person detector and you use this to analyze how well that person detector did, it's going to give you a lot more false positives than they actually exist because of the missing people. But yeah, so, although this has some ways to go, we still think that this is useful, and we hope that this will start to close the fairness-related analysis gap that exists in the computer vision world. And we really want all of you to use it. So there is a QR code that links straight to the data set. It's kind of a fun data set to walk through if you have the time. But yeah, so that's all I've got to say about that. Do you guys have any questions?
Thank you, Candice. Anyone who has a question, they can unmute themselves and ask directly.
Hi, Candice. This is Nihesh.
Hi.
Great talk, and I understand this is a great undertaking. Massive amount of annotators are probably needed to do this. So that kind of that's where my question lies on is some of these are, like you said, perceived gender or age, right? So oftentimes these can be in the eye of the beholder, either internal bias or culturally determined. So I was wondering about if it was annotated by multiple people, or how was the inter-rater reliability calculated, and in case of disagreement, how was it revised or resolved? Thank you.
Sure, yeah. So yes, basically it was done by multiple annotators, and when there was confusion around a particular attribute, the majority vote was taken. But if nothing could be, or if everyone said something different, it was just set to unknown, which seems like the safer bet. I don't have the numbers on inter-rater reliability at the moment, though. Yes, and yeah, so also a lot of you're right about it being very subjective. Each of the annotators were also given a slide deck for examples for each of the different attributes that they could rely on. So obviously that won't fix all of the bias issues internally, but hopefully it allowed for at least some consistency across annotators.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that clarifies a lot of things, and definitely a step in the right direction. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hey, this is not so much a question as a comment.
Mhm.
Hey, I just wanted to point out that, you know, I think there's this attitude that more labels is always better in the computer vision community. You get these data sets with just tons and tons of labeled things. But actually, you know, in real situations, no one is interested in labeling 1,000 different things in their images. And I think, so I guess the question is, what was wrong with the original labels? Or rather, why did the original labels fail? Is it because they were poorly constructed, or just because, yeah, I guess I'm just curious, do you think the original label set was poorly constructed? Or do you think that it's just an inherent problem that labeling too many things creates these kinds of ambiguities? I'm inclined to think they were poorly constructed. You get a lot of these visual models, like, so ImageNet, for example, is categorized based on WordNet, but that doesn't really make any sense, right? Like taking this semantic word hierarchy and then putting it on you know, pixels doesn't necessarily make any. The hierarchy of words does not necessarily have to be the hierarchy for pixels, right? So I guess my question is, why do these things fail? Do you think that the label space could have been constructed better originally, or do you think that it's just inherently difficult to construct these spaces and there's not a better way that they could have worked with the variety of labels that they had?
I think it's a combination of both, right? I mean, like 600 labels of, you know, of just the boxable labels is a lot of labels. And at least from the person-centric side of it, like, you know, treating people as objects doesn't really work as well as, you know, like other things do. Because you get, you know, inherent biases and stuff like that. But yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, right? Like with the person side of things, like, you know, one of the biggest issues that I've seen in computer vision is like this, you know, idea of using, you know, man, woman, boy, girl, or whatever as labels when there's like very clear confusion, you know, when like, you know, people find it difficult really to label boundary cases. But yeah, it's like it's taken from words instead of from, you know, the actual tasks that you know, people are trying to do with computer vision. Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. I don't know if that's a good answer, but
I'm curious, do you think there are things about your label space that could have been, I'm just kind of, you know, kind of curious, are there problems with your label definitions that you guys noticed after the results came back? Like you started going through the data set and noticed certain consistent problems?
with the MeApp data set,
Yeah.
I mean, well, I think in terms of like, it was successful in terms of like all of the people were boxed. There's still some definite confusion between predominantly feminine and predominantly masculine. You know, some people, you know, just don't really understand that, I guess. And, you know, trying to give instructions on, you know, what does predominantly feminine mean versus what does predominantly masculine mean is very subjective. So we definitely had some confusion where, you know, and those confusions just got set to unknown. And you know, the same thing with age range, right? Like when does a person no longer considered young is kind of confusing as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been reading a lot of literature recently on gender labeling, and actually it's really interesting how you get these huge disparities in the way people label things depending on the exact semantics of the instructions that you give, right? So if
Yep.
you ask somebody is masculine or feminine, that isn't necessarily, it could be that you see someone who presents as a woman but is also masculine, right? Like not necessarily the same thing. Like there are people who might perceive a person in a military uniform as masculine regardless of their gender.
Right.
it's not necessarily a classification that I would agree with, but there are people that might choose to label images that way, right?
Yeah.
So a very fraught and difficult thing. So you mentioned at the end that you don't think that people should use your data set to train gender classifiers. I guess I'm kind of curious why you say that. Is it because you think people just shouldn't be creating such classifiers in general, or because you think your data set is inadequate for those purposes? Maybe your audio is dead, or maybe my audio is dead. I can't hear you, Candice.
Okay, I can hear again. Were you talking?
I was just saying I can't hear you if you're speaking. I couldn't hear you.
Yep. Cool. Okay. Yep. I couldn't.
So I guess maybe to clarify my question, there are situations where you might think it's legitimate to do gender. There are people who take the philosophical position that you should never do gender labeling, and that's reasonable. I personally don't take that position. I think that there are situations where gender labeling is legitimate. For example, you might want to use it to study, gender or discrimination issues, or you might want to use it in medical situations where you want to be able to make predictions that are more accurate when they are accompanied by a prediction of that type, right?
Sure.
So I don't feel that it's necessarily inappropriate to do gender labeling.
Yeah.
The question becomes what would make a data set appropriate for that? I mean, do you think your data set lives up to strong enough standards that it could be used for such things, or do you think that there are systematic problems with it that would prohibit that?
I think so. There's two answers from this. Is that like the first thing we ask that people don't create a gender classifier or a gender age classifier is because we don't know, like when we just release this data set to the world, we don't know what that is going to be used for. So having a blanket statement saying like, just don't do this, hopefully will prevent, some of the bad things. But also like, this isn't, it's a relatively small data set in terms of like, computer vision. So like 100K images to create a gender or an accurate gender or age classifier. I'm not sure if that's, good enough to do that. And also like the data set is still very heavily skewed towards predominantly masculine versus predominantly feminine. So yeah, it's not a balanced data set. It's not balanced in terms of gender presentation or in terms of geographical location, or probably we haven't run skin tone analysis, but I'm assuming it is not at all balanced in terms of skin tone either. So presumably, if you create a gender or age classifier based off of this, it is going to be heavily biased towards predominantly masculine, as well as like may not work as well for various skin tones or various, geographical locations.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree with you that like there are some cases where, a gender classifier can be used for good. But when releasing a data set, you can't really control that.
Right. Yep, that's always the difficulty.
Yeah.
And if you are going to release data sets, so I think it's good to have data sets that are thoughtful and accurate. And it definitely seems like you guys have taken the time to do that. So I think that's terrific. Let's see.
Are there any other questions or comments?
I'm going to have like 5 more questions as soon as the talk ends, but I'm pretty sure I won't be able to think of those until after the Zoom session is over. So
yeah, feel free to email me or whatever. Any questions that you have, I'd be more than willing to answer. If you can't think of them right now.
Sounds good. Thanks, Candice.
Yep. Cool. All right. I don't think there's any other questions.
Yeah, I suppose there are no more questions. So thank you, Candice. Thank you again. Great talk. It was great having you here. And
Yeah, thank you
everyone,
for inviting me.
oh yeah, and everyone, thank you. Thank you for joining.